At my daughter's office, I watched a man lean down close to her ear and whisper something that made her hands shake so badly she dropped the coffee cup she was holding. She laughed it off in front of me, told me it was nothing, told me she was just tired. I said nothing that day. But 3 weeks later, I stood on a stage in front of 200 investors with a folder full of everything that man had ever tried to hide. And by the time I finished speaking, federal agents were putting him in handcuffs in front of every camera in the room. Before I tell you exactly how a quiet, retired old man brought down an entire criminal empire to protect his only daughter, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe the most dangerous man in any room is often the one everyone assumes they can ignore. My name is Michael Carter. I am 68 years old, and for 31 years I served with the United States Border Patrol, the last 14 of those years leading a special operations unit that handled cases most people never hear about. Human trafficking networks, cartel logistics, financial crimes that cross the border in both directions. I spent those 14 years running joint task force operations out of a windowless building near the Arizona border, coordinating with the DEA, the FBI, and half a dozen other agencies whose names most civilians never learn, building cases that sometimes took years to bring to trial, and sometimes never made it to trial at all, because the men we were chasing simply disappeared into networks too large and too well-funded to fully dismantle. I was known, among the small circle of agents who worked closely with me, as a patient man, sometimes to a fault. I remember a younger agent early in my career, asking me why I never seemed in a hurry to make an arrest, the moment we had enough evidence to justify one. I told him something my own training officer had told me decades earlier, that the men who rush an arrest usually end up with a small fish and an empty net, while the men who wait, who gather everything, who understand the entire structure before they move, usually end up dismantling the whole operation, instead of just clipping off its most visible edge. That philosophy defined my entire career. And it would come to define, in ways I could never have anticipated, exactly how I handled what happened to my daughter. I retired 4 years ago, not because I wanted to, but because my body finally told me it was time, my knees and my back carrying the weight of 3 decades of fieldwork that never once made it into a headline. The ceremony was small, a handful of colleagues, a folded flag, a commendation plaque that now sits in a drawer in my study, because I've never been the kind of man who needed to display his accomplishments on a wall. My wife Diane passed away 7 years ago from ovarian cancer, 3 years before my retirement, and I remember thinking, standing at her graveside in my dress uniform, that I had spent 31 years protecting strangers and had somehow run out of time to properly protect the one person who mattered most. That thought never fully left me, and I believe, looking back now, it shaped everything about how carefully I moved once I understood Emma might be in danger. Our daughter Emma was the only family I had left worth building the rest of my life around after Diane passed. The house grew quiet in a way I never fully adjusted to, and my days settled into the kind of careful routine that retired men build for themselves when the structure of a career suddenly disappears. Morning coffee on the back porch, a small garden I'd never had time for during my career, weekly phone calls with Emma that I looked forward to more than I probably let on. Emma is 31 years old, sharp, hardworking, the kind of young woman who put herself through business school on scholarships and part-time jobs because she refused to let me pay for something she believed she should earn herself, a stubbornness I recognized immediately because I'd raised her to have it. Diane used to say Emma had my discipline and her own mother's warmth, a combination that made her fiercely capable but also, I would come to understand, dangerously prone to shouldering burdens quietly rather than asking for help. She spent her 20s working her way up through corporate finance roles at increasingly larger companies, always underpaid relative to her talent, always overlooked for promotions that went instead to men with louder voices and thinner resumes. I remember more than one Sunday dinner where she'd vent quietly about being passed over again, always following it with a tired smile and the same phrase, "It's fine, Dad. I'll just work harder and make it impossible for them to ignore me next time." She never once considered that the problem might not be her effort. So when she called me 8 months ago, practically vibrating with excitement, to tell me she'd landed a senior financial analyst position at a fast-growing technology company called Langford Dynamics, I felt something I hadn't felt in years watching my daughter build her own life. Pure, uncomplicated pride. She described the signing bonus, the salary that finally matched her qualifications, the modern downtown office with a view of the river, and I remember sitting in my kitchen that evening after we hung up, allowing myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to simply feel happy for her, without the low hum of worry that had followed every other job change in her career. The company was run by a man named Victor Lang, 45 years old, a charismatic entrepreneur who had built Langford Dynamics from a small logistics software startup into what appeared to be a rapidly expanding financial technology company, the kind of business that got glowing profiles in regional business magazines and courted government contracts with an aggressiveness that, in hindsight, should have concerned more people than it did. Victor had the polished confidence of a man who had never once doubted himself in public. Expensive suits, a voice trained for boardrooms, the kind of easy charm that made people want to trust him before they'd earned any reason to. Emma had mentioned him a handful of times in the early months, always in glowing terms, describing him as demanding but visionary, the kind of boss who pushed people to be better versions of themselves. I had no reason at the time to hear anything in that description, except a young woman excited about a talented mentor. Victor had built his public reputation carefully over nearly a decade, cultivating relationships with local politicians, sponsoring youth sports leagues, appearing at charity galas with the practiced ease of a man who understood that visibility and virtue, performed loudly enough and often enough, tend to insulate a person from the kind of scrutiny that might otherwise catch what's happening beneath the surface. He had, according to everything Emma initially told me, built Langford Dynamics into exactly the kind of success story small business owners in our region pointed to as proof that hard work and vision still mattered. I would later learn just how carefully constructed that story actually was. I want to tell you about the day everything changed, because I remember it with a clarity that surprises me even now. Emma had invited me to visit her new office downtown, proud to show her father the sleek glass building, the modern workspace, the corner she'd earned in a company that seemed to be going places. I remember the drive-in, the way I'd worn my good jacket instead of the flannel I usually reached for, wanting, in some small way, to look like a father worth being proud of when Emma introduced me to her colleagues. I arrived a few minutes early and waited near the elevator bank on the 14th floor, close enough to see into the glass-walled conference room where Emma stood with a man I would later learn was Victor Lang himself. The office around me hummed with the particular energy of a company that wanted visitors to feel its momentum. Open floor plans, employees moving briskly between standing desks, a wall of framed magazine profiles near the reception area, celebrating Victor's rise. I remember thinking in that first innocent moment, how proud Diane would have been to see our daughter working somewhere that looked this alive. Then I watched him lean down close to her ear, his hand resting on the back of her chair, in a way that had nothing to do with friendliness, and whatever he said made the color drain completely from my daughter's face. Her hands began shaking so badly that the coffee cup she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, and Victor simply straightened up, smiled at the small crowd of employees who turned to look, made some light joke about clumsy mornings that drew a few polite laughs, and walked away as though nothing had happened at all. I noticed, watching from behind that glass wall, that not a single employee in that room looked directly at Emma while she knelt to gather the broken pieces of the cup. They all looked away, quickly, deliberately, the way people look away from something they've learned it's safer not to see. When Emma saw me a moment later, she forced a bright smile onto her face, told me she'd just spilled her coffee, laughed off my concern, and spent the rest of our lunch together talking about anything except what I had actually witnessed through that glass wall. She talked about a project she was excited about a coworker's engagement, about wanting to repaint her apartment, an unusually long stream of unrelated topics that I recognized, even then, as the particular kind of talking people do when they're trying to outrun a silence they're afraid of. I did not push her that day. 31 years in federal law enforcement teaches a man that pushing too hard, too fast, closes doors permanently, especially with someone you love, who has already decided they'd rather protect you than burden you. I drove home that evening and sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, replaying the moment, the particular way Victor Lang's hand had rested on my daughter's chair, the particular way her entire body had gone rigid, and I understood, with the same certainty I'd relied on for 3 decades in the field, that something was very wrong. Emma called me 2 days later, her voice carrying a forced lightness that didn't match the tension I could hear underneath it. She mentioned, almost too casually, that work had been stressful lately, that she'd been putting in long hours reviewing some complicated accounts, and that she might not be able to make our usual Sunday dinner for a few weeks. I told her that was fine, that I understood, and I hung up the phone knowing with absolute certainty that my daughter was lying to me, not out of malice, but out of the same protective instinct I'd spent her entire childhood teaching her, the instinct to shield the people you love from your own burdens. Over the following days, I found myself noticing small things I might have missed if I hadn't already been watching so closely. Emma stopped posting on social media the way she normally did. Small, everyday moments. A coffee shop she liked. A photo of her dog on a walk. The ordinary digital trail of a young woman living an ordinary life. She started declining invitations to things she would normally have jumped at. A friend's birthday dinner. A weekend hiking trip we'd planned together months earlier. When I called, she answered more slowly than usual, and I could hear, in the background sometimes, the particular hollow quiet of someone sitting alone in an empty apartment, rather than the low hum of a life still moving forward normally. I drove past her apartment building one evening, not to intrude, simply to reassure myself, and I saw her car in the parking lot at nearly 9 at night on a weeknight, her office light still visible through the third-floor window she'd once excitedly shown me during a video call. A 31-year-old financial analyst working that late, night after night, isn't necessarily a red flag on its own. But combined with everything else, the shaking hands, the shattered coffee cup, the forced brightness in her voice, every time we spoke, it painted a picture I couldn't ignore any longer. And it was that evening, sitting in my car outside her building, watching that light stay on far longer than any healthy workload should require, that I finally called Frank. I called Frank Sullivan that same night. Frank had been my closest friend and partner for nearly 20 of my 31 years in federal service. A retired FBI financial crimes investigator who had spent his career untangling exactly the kind of corporate fraud schemes I suspected might be sitting underneath Emma's glittering new employer. Frank and I had first crossed paths on a joint task force operation back in the late 90s. A case involving a trucking company that turned out to be moving far more than freight across the border. And we'd worked so many cases together over the following 2 decades that our wives used to joke we spent more evenings on the phone with each other than with them. Frank had retired 3 years before me, moving out to a modest property 40 minutes outside the city, where he spent his days restoring old trucks and, more usefully for our purposes now, maintaining a network of contacts across federal financial crimes divisions that most active agents would have envied. Frank answered on the second ring, the way he always had during our working years, a habit neither of us had ever fully shaken even in retirement. When I explained what I'd witnessed through that glass wall, the particular way Victor Lang's hand had rested on Emma's chair, the way her whole body had gone rigid, Frank went quiet for a long moment. The kind of silence I recognized from decades of watching him process a case in real time. "Mike," he finally said, "if your gut is telling you something's wrong, you and I both know your gut has never once been wrong in 30 years. Let's find out what we're actually looking at, before we do anything Emma might not forgive us for." I remember feeling, hearing him say it, a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that I wasn't imagining things. Dread at what we might actually find. Frank drove out to my house the following morning, and we sat at my kitchen table the way we had 100 times before over the years. A legal pad between us, 2 cups of coffee going cold, as we mapped out exactly how to approach this carefully, methodically, without ever putting Emma at greater risk than she might already be in. "We do this exactly like we'd do it for a case," Frank said. "No assumptions, no shortcuts, everything documented properly. If this turns out to be nothing, we walk away and never mention it again. If it's something, we need it airtight before we move an inch." I agreed without hesitation. 31 years of training doesn't simply disappear the moment you retire. And if anything, I found myself grateful, sitting at that table, that it hadn't. Over the following weeks, Frank and I worked the way we always had, methodically, quietly, treating this like any investigation we'd conducted during our careers. Except this time the stakes belonged to my own daughter, instead of a case file. Frank still maintained relationships with contacts in financial crimes enforcement, people who owed him favors from decades of cases they'd worked together, And I still remembered every technique for surveillance, documentation, and pattern recognition that had defined my career leading special operations along the border. We started with public records, corporate filings, government contract databases, the kind of information available to anyone patient enough to actually read through it carefully instead of skimming for headlines. We spent the first several days simply establishing a baseline, pulling every publicly available document related to Langford Dynamics, incorporation records, annual reports filed with the state, press releases going back to the company's founding 6 years earlier. Frank built a timeline on his garage corkboard, the same way he'd organized every major case of his career, pinning printed documents in chronological order and slowly connecting them with red string as patterns began to emerge. I remember standing beside him on the third evening, looking at that board, and feeling the particular cold clarity that used to settle over me right before a major operation. The sense that pieces were beginning to align into something far larger than either of us had initially expected. What we found in those first 2 weeks was troubling enough to make both of us set aside any doubt that we were chasing shadows. Langford Dynamics had been awarded 3 separate government contracts over the past 18 months, each one significantly larger than what a company of its size and history would typically qualify for. Each one processed through a procurement channel that Frank recognized immediately as unusually loosely supervised. The kind of channel that experienced fraud, investigators learned to view with automatic suspicion. The company's reported revenue growth, when Frank ran it against industry benchmarks he'd used throughout his career catching exactly this kind of fraud, simply did not match the physical footprint of the business. Too much money, moving through too small an operation, with too few actual clients, to justify the numbers on paper. "Mike," Frank said one night, tapping a printed spreadsheet with the end of his pen, "a company this size, doing legitimate business, would need at minimum 40 or 50 active enterprise clients to generate the revenue they're reporting. I count 11 documented clients in their public filings, and 3 of those 11 are shell entities I already recognize from an old case I never managed to close." Frank reached out quietly to a former colleague, still working in the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had trained under Frank early in her career, and still, 2 decades later, trusted his judgment enough to take his call seriously, without demanding formal justification first, careful not to trigger any formal inquiry that might alert Victor Lang before we understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. Denise agreed to run a handful of discrete database checks, framing them internally as routine background research rather than an active investigation, buying us time to build our case properly before anything became visible to Victor or his associates. What came back, over the following 10 days, painted a picture far darker than either of us had initially suspected. Langford Dynamics appeared to be functioning as a sophisticated money laundering operation, using the government contracts as a legitimizing front, while actually processing funds connected to at least 2 organized criminal networks operating across 3 states. Victor Lang himself had 2 prior business ventures that had collapsed under suspicious circumstances, both times with investors left holding worthless paper, while Victor walked away with capital nobody could ever fully trace. Denise's preliminary check also flagged a name that made Frank sit back in his chair and let out a long breath. Dominic Reyes, a regional organized crime figure whose name Frank recognized from a case nearly a decade earlier that had gone cold for lack of sufficient evidence. A case Frank had always privately considered one of the few real failures of his career. I remember sitting in Frank's garage, the same converted workspace where he'd kept his case files organized for decades, staring at a corkboard, covered in printouts and red string connecting shell companies to shell companies, and feeling something I hadn't felt since my last active case before retirement. A cold, focused clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with purpose. Frank looked at me across that garage and asked the question that mattered most. "What do you think he's using Emma for, Mike? A finance woman with her skill set doesn't get hired by accident into a company running numbers like this." We found the answer 3 days later, and it was worse than either of us had prepared for. Emma, in her role reviewing financial reconciliations, had apparently begun noticing discrepancies in the accounts several weeks before I ever visited that office. Small inconsistencies that, to a less careful analyst, might have passed as clerical error, but that Emma, with her sharp attention to detail, had flagged internally through the company's standard compliance channel. I remember Frank finding the email trail, forwarded through a chain of internal system logs that Denise had been able to access under the pretext of a routine cybersecurity audit, and reading it aloud to me at his kitchen table, watching my own hands tighten into fists as the timeline became clear. Emma had done exactly what she was trained to do, exactly what any honest analyst should do, and it had made her a target. Victor Lang had personally intercepted that flag before it reached anyone else, and the conversation I'd witnessed through the glass wall that day was, according to what we eventually pieced together from a combination of internal calendar records and a second-hand account Frank carefully obtained from a former Langford employee willing to talk off the record, Victor threatening to destroy her career and her reputation permanently if she pursued the discrepancy any further, warning her that he had the connections and the resources to make sure no financial firm in the state would ever hire her again, and worse, hinting at consequences that reached beyond her professional life entirely. Frank arranged to meet Curtis Boyle at a quiet diner off the interstate, choosing the location specifically because it sat far enough outside the city that the odds of anyone from Langford Dynamics recognizing either of them were essentially non-existent. I sat 2 booths away, close enough to listen without appearing connected to the conversation, an old habit from surveillance work that Frank and I fell back into as naturally as breathing. Curtis arrived nervous, glancing repeatedly toward the door, ordering coffee he never actually drank, and it took nearly 20 minutes of careful, patient conversation before Frank managed to put him at ease enough to speak freely. Curtis explained that he'd worked in Langford's accounting department for just under 2 years before resigning abruptly, telling his family and friends at the time that he simply wanted a change of pace, a story he admitted to Frank was a complete fabrication. The real reason, he said, lowering his voice even in that nearly empty diner, was a colleague named Rebecca, who had raised similar concerns to the ones Emma would later raise, and who had been quietly pushed out of the company within 3 weeks. Her professional reputation, mysteriously damaged by rumors, Curtis strongly suspected Victor's people had deliberately spread to ensure no other company would hire her. I watched what happened to Rebecca, and I just left, Curtis told Frank. I didn't have proof of anything back then, not real proof, just a bad feeling, and a friend who disappeared from the industry overnight. I've regretted not doing more about it every single day since. Frank asked him carefully, without pushing too hard, whether he still had access to any records from his time at the company, anything at all that might corroborate what he was describing. Curtis hesitated for a long moment before admitting that he'd kept a personal notebook during his final months at Langford, documenting dates and details of things that troubled him, never quite working up the courage to bring it to anyone, telling himself repeatedly that it probably wasn't his business, that he probably didn't have the full picture, the same kind of self-doubt that keeps so many people quiet in the face of something they know, deep down, isn't right. He agreed, after Frank explained carefully and honestly what we suspected was happening to Emma, to share that notebook, and to consider testifying formally if it ever came to that. Frank told me afterward, driving home that evening, that Curtis's notebook alone corroborated nearly everything we had already pieced together independently, and confirmed, devastatingly, that Emma was not the first employee Victor Lang had threatened into silence. She was simply the first one with a father who refused to let it go unanswered. What Frank and I discovered next made my blood run cold in a way very few things had during my entire career. Buried in a set of internal documents Frank's contact had flagged for us, we found evidence that Victor Lang was actively preparing a contingency plan, should the fraud ever come under serious investigation, that involved shifting formal signing authority and documented responsibility for several of the most damning transactions onto Emma's name specifically, using her legitimate compliance flag as evidence that she had discovered and continued the scheme independently, a narrative constructed carefully enough that, on paper, it would appear my daughter was the mastermind, rather than the whistleblower Victor was actively silencing. I sat in Frank's garage that night, staring at printed copies of forged authorization documents already bearing a signature that looked, at a glance, almost exactly like Emma's, close enough to fool anyone who didn't know her handwriting as intimately as I did. And I understood, with total clarity, that Victor Lang wasn't simply threatening my daughter's career. He was building the machinery to destroy her entire life and walk away clean himself. I did not tell Emma what we had found, not yet. I understood, sitting with that information for the first time, exactly why my daughter had been too frightened to come to me directly. She wasn't protecting her pride, she was protecting me from a man she genuinely believed had the power to destroy both our lives, if either of us moved too quickly or too visibly. I made the decision that night, the same decision I had made dozens of times throughout my career facing men who believed themselves untouchable, that the only way to protect her completely was to move slower and more carefully than Victor Lang could possibly anticipate, gathering everything, documenting everything, and waiting for the single moment when exposing it would leave him with absolutely no room to maneuver. Over the following 6 weeks, Frank and I built what amounted to a complete federal case file, working almost entirely outside any formal investigative process, because neither of us wanted to risk tipping off Victor Lang before we had irrefutable proof. I began visiting Emma more frequently, ostensibly just a father checking in on his daughter, bringing lunch to her office, meeting her for coffee near the building, and during those visits I quietly observed everything I could about the building's security, the executive floor's layout, the patterns of who came and went from Victor's office and when. I had spent 14 years learning how to read a facility's rhythms without ever appearing to pay attention, and those instincts, dormant for 4 years of retirement, came back with a speed that honestly surprised me. Frank, meanwhile, worked his remaining contacts to trace the shell company network back to its actual beneficiaries, uncovering links to a regional organized crime figure named Dominic Reyes, who had been under intermittent federal surveillance for nearly a decade, without enough hard evidence to bring formal charges. Frank spent long nights on secure calls with Denise and 2 other contacts, slowly piecing together a corporate structure that spanned 4 states and involved nearly a dozen shell entities, each one designed to obscure the true flow of money by another layer, the kind of deliberately confusing architecture that only someone with decades of financial crimes experience could hope to untangle in any reasonable time frame. We obtained, through careful and largely legal means, that Frank insisted on documenting meticulously, at every step, specifically to ensure nothing we gathered would later be thrown out on a technicality. Copies of internal financial records Emma herself had unknowingly generated as part of her normal compliance duties. Records that, once properly organized and cross-referenced against the government contract data, painted an undeniable picture of a laundering operation moving nearly $11 million over 18 months through fabricated consulting invoices and inflated contract deliverables. Frank walked me through each layer of the scheme late one night at his kitchen table, laying it out with the patient clarity of a man who had spent a career explaining exactly this kind of fraud to juries who'd never studied finance a day in their lives. It's actually elegant, in a repulsive way, he told me. They inflate a legitimate contract's deliverables, pay a shell consulting firm for work that was never done, and that shell firm quietly returns the money to Reyes's network, minus a cut for Victor. Every transaction on its own looks almost defensible. It's only when you line up all of them together that the pattern becomes impossible to explain away. I want to be honest about something during this period. Victor Lang, during my visits to Emma's office, had begun to notice me more directly, and rather than treating a 68-year-old retired man with any caution, he treated me the way he apparently treated everyone he considered beneath his attention, with a casual, dismissive contempt that, in hindsight, worked entirely in my favor. He made comments to Emma about her old-fashioned father checking in on her like she was still in school. He once, passing me in the hallway, made a joking remark to a colleague about retired government workers having nothing better to do than hang around lobbies drinking free coffee, loud enough that he clearly intended for me to hear it. Another time, waiting for Emma near the elevator, I watched him walk past and say, without even slowing down, "Sir, this is a working office, not a retirement community," to a small ripple of nervous laughter from 2 junior employees standing nearby, who clearly felt obligated to laugh along with their boss. I let every one of those comments land without reaction. I smiled, nodded, played the part of the harmless old man exactly as long as I needed to. Because a man who underestimates you is a man who stops watching you carefully, and Victor Lang stopped watching me almost entirely within the first 2 weeks. There is a particular kind of discipline required to absorb that sort of contempt from the man actively threatening your daughter's future without ever letting your face betray what you actually know. And I will admit, it tested me in ways very few things during my career ever had. More, honestly, than most of the actual dangerous confrontations I'd faced along the border. But I had spent 31 years learning that the appearance of weakness, worn deliberately and patiently, is sometimes the single greatest advantage available to you, and I was not about to abandon that lesson now, when it mattered more than it ever had. During one of those visits, roughly 4 weeks into our investigation, I made the decision to begin documenting things more directly. With guidance from Denise on exactly what would remain legally admissible, I began wearing a small recording device during my visits to Emma's office, positioned specifically to capture any further interactions between Victor and Emma, should they occur in my presence. It felt strange, I'll admit, dressing for a simple lunch visit to my daughter, the same careful way I once dressed for undercover operations, along dangerous stretches of border territory, checking the device twice, running through in my mind exactly how I'd explain my presence if anyone questioned it. But it paid off twice over those final weeks, capturing 2 separate conversations in which Victor, growing increasingly confident that Emma had been sufficiently intimidated into silence, spoke with a carelessness that would later prove devastating to his own defense. The turning point came when Victor announced, with the kind of fanfare that told me everything about his priorities, a major company launch event scheduled 6 weeks out, a glittering evening designed to bring in a new round of institutional investors, and, according to internal planning documents Emma unknowingly helped compile as part of her normal duties, to formally close a 9-figure investment deal that would have allowed Victor to expand the laundering operation to a scale nearly 4 times its current size. Emma, still unaware of everything Frank and I had uncovered, mentioned during one of our lunches that Victor wanted her on stage during the event, presented publicly as the sharp young financial mind behind the company's rigorous compliance culture, a detail that made my stomach turn once I understood what it actually meant. Victor intended to use my daughter as a living prop in his fraud, parading her credibility in front of investors at the exact moment he needed it most, all while quietly preparing the paper trail that would make her the scapegoat the moment anything ever went wrong. I made a decision that night that I have not regretted for a single moment since. I would not go to the authorities first, not because I doubted the strength of what Frank and I had gathered, but because I understood, from 3 decades of watching how these cases actually unfold in practice, that a man like Victor Lang, given even a few hours' warning through a leaked investigation, had more than enough resources to disappear, to destroy evidence, to shift blame permanently onto my daughter, before any arrest could ever be made. The only way to guarantee Emma's complete protection was to expose everything in a single, undeniable, public moment, with federal law enforcement already positioned and ready to act the instant the evidence became public, leaving Victor Lang absolutely no window to maneuver, negotiate, or retaliate. Frank made the necessary calls to his former colleagues at the Financial Crimes Task Force during the final 2 weeks before the launch event, presenting our complete file, meticulously organized and legally sourced, to agents who recognized immediately what they were looking at. I remember sitting in a nondescript federal building conference room with Frank, watching a team of agents review 6 weeks of our work, watching the careful, professional shift in their expressions as they understood the scale of what we'd uncovered. Boxes of printed documents sat stacked on the table between us, alongside a laptop containing everything digitized and cross-referenced. The same methodical organization Frank had used throughout his entire career. The kind of presentation that made a prosecutor's job significantly easier down the line. The lead agent, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Special Agent Patricia Nguyen, spent nearly 3 hours going through our material line by line, occasionally stopping to ask a clarifying question, occasionally exchanging a glance with the younger agent beside her that told me she was recalculating, in real time, exactly how large this case actually was. When she finally sat back in her chair, she looked across the table at me and asked a question I'll never forget. "Mr. Carter, most people who bring us cases this thorough are still active law enforcement, with full department resources behind them. You did all of this alone, as a retired 68-year-old civilian, to protect your daughter?" I told her the truth. I told her that 31 years chasing men exactly like Victor Lang had taught me that the most dangerous cases are the ones where the people who love you can't see the danger clearly, because they're standing too close to it, and that Emma needed someone standing far enough back to see the whole picture. I told her about Frank, about our history together, about the 20 years we'd spent building exactly this kind of case for the government, before either of us ever imagined we'd need those same skills to protect our own family. Agent Nguyen listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she simply nodded once, the way experienced investigators do when they've decided someone can be trusted completely. "There's a reason cases like this usually take our division a year or more to build from scratch," she said. "You've handed us something that would normally require a task force of a dozen agents working full-time for months. I need to bring this to my supervisor immediately, but I want you to understand, Mr. Carter, this is going to move fast now, and I need your continued cooperation, and your discretion, more than almost anything else. If Victor Lang gets even a whisper that federal agents are actively building a case, everything you've spent 6 weeks protecting could disappear in an afternoon." Agent Nguyen and her team agreed to coordinate their action around the launch event, positioning agents discreetly among the catering staff, security personnel, and even several posing as prospective investors, ready to move the instant the evidence went public. It was, she told me privately during a follow-up call 3 days later, one of the most complete cases her division had received in years, built entirely by a retired father and his equally retired best friend, working out of a converted garage. She also told me something that stayed with me through everything that followed. Most whistleblower cases we handle involve someone panicking, going to the press too early, blowing up their own evidence before it's ready. What you did instead was run a proper operation. I've worked with active agents who couldn't have executed this as cleanly as you and Mr. Sullivan did. The night of the launch arrived on a clear autumn evening. The venue, a glass-walled ballroom downtown filled with nearly 200 investors, business journalists, and Victor Lang's carefully curated circle of associates, all mingling under soft gold lighting, while a string quartet played somewhere near the entrance. I arrived early, dressed in the same dark suit I'd worn to Diane's funeral, feeling a strange echo of significance in that choice I hadn't fully intended, but didn't correct once I noticed it. Frank waited outside in his truck, in constant quiet contact with Agent Nguyen's team, ready to relay any last logistical detail as the evening unfolded. I found a position near the back of the room, close enough to the stage to move quickly when the moment came. Far enough that Victor's attention, when it swept briefly across the crowd during his opening remarks, passed over me without pausing, exactly as it had for 6 weeks. I watched caterers moving through the room with trays of champagne, recognizing at least 3 of them as agents from the brief operational briefing Agent Nguyen had allowed me to sit in on 2 days earlier. Their movements careful and deliberate, in a way I doubt anyone else in that room would have noticed, but that my own training made impossible to miss. Emma stood near the stage and addressed Victor's team had selected for her, visibly uncomfortable in a way I don't think anyone else in that room noticed except me, her father, who had spent her entire childhood learning to read every small shift in her expression. I watched her scan the crowd once, briefly, and I made sure, when our eyes met for just a moment, to give her nothing more than a warm, ordinary smile. The same smile I'd give her at any family gathering. Nothing that might betray the 6 weeks of work, about to reach its conclusion. She smiled back, small and tired, clearly still believing this was simply another difficult night she'd have to endure, before finding some way, eventually, to extract herself from Victor's company entirely. Victor took the stage roughly 40 minutes into the event, delivering a polished, confident presentation about Langford Dynamics' explosive growth, its commitment to uncompromising financial integrity, and its readiness to scale into a new tier of government and institutional partnerships. He moved across that stage with the easy command of a man who had never once faced a consequence he couldn't charm his way around, gesturing at slides showing upward trending graphs, quoting figures I now knew, with absolute certainty, were partially or entirely fabricated. The investors in that room, wealthy, experienced people who prided themselves on due diligence, nodded along, scribbled notes, exchanged approving glances with one another, entirely unaware they were watching a performance rather than a business update. He gestured for Emma to join him on stage at the appropriate moment, introducing her exactly as planned, as the brilliant young analyst whose rigorous standards represented everything the company stood for, a line that made my jaw tighten so hard I felt it in my teeth. I watched my daughter stand there under those lights, forcing a smile for a room full of strangers, having no idea that everything was about to change in the next several minutes, having no idea that the man standing beside her, praising her publicly, had spent weeks quietly preparing documents that would have branded her a criminal the moment his scheme ever came under scrutiny. I walked toward the stage myself, once Victor opened the floor for a brief question period, and I asked, in a calm, carrying voice that surprised even me with its steadiness, whether I might have a moment to speak, introducing myself simply as a retired federal officer, with a few questions about the company's recent government contracts. Victor, visibly caught off guard but unwilling to appear rattled in front of 200 investors, gestured for me to take the microphone, clearly assuming, based on weeks of dismissing me as a harmless old man loitering in his lobby, that whatever I had to say would be easily managed, perhaps even useful as a moment of unplanned authenticity for his carefully staged evening. I stood on that stage, looked out at the room, found Emma's eyes for just a moment, and then I began. I introduced myself properly this time, 31 years, with United States Border Patrol Special Operations, and I told the room that I had spent the past 6 weeks investigating serious financial crimes connected directly to the company they were about to invest millions of dollars into. I kept my voice level, procedural, the same tone I'd used 100 times briefing senior officials on operations far more dangerous than this one, and I watched, out of the corner of my eye, Victor's practiced smile begin to falter for the first time since I'd known him. A large screen behind me, which Frank had helped coordinate through the event's own technical staff under a plausible pretext arranged with Agent Wynn's team, began displaying, one by one, the evidence we had spent 6 weeks assembling. Bank records showing the flow of laundered funds through 11 shell entities, each transaction highlighted and annotated with the same clarity Frank had once used to explain cases to federal juries. Security footage from Victor's own office, capturing the exact moment he threatened Emma near that glass conference room. His hand on her chair, her face draining of color. The moment I had witnessed with my own eyes, now visible to 200 strangers. Audio recordings obtained legally through a device I had quietly worn during 2 subsequent visits once I understood what was happening, of Victor explicitly describing his plan to shift documented responsibility onto Emma's name, his own voice. Unmistakable, filling that ballroom with words he'd clearly never imagined an audience would hear. Forged contracts bearing signatures that forensic analysis had already confirmed were not authentically hers. Displayed alongside genuine samples of Emma's actual signature, so the discrepancy was impossible to miss, even from the back of the room. The room fell into a silence unlike anything I had experienced even during my career. 200 people staring at a screen that was, in real time, dismantling the entire foundation of the company they had gathered to celebrate. I heard, somewhere behind me, the distinct sound of a champagne glass being set down carefully on a table. The small, ordinary noise, somehow amplified by the sheer stillness of the room. Journalists near the back began pulling out phones, some already typing furiously, sensing the magnitude of the story unfolding in front of them. Victor's face went through a transformation I will remember for the rest of my life. Confidence collapsing into confusion, then panic, then the particular kind of desperate calculation men make when they realize every exit has already been closed. He started toward the microphone, started to speak, opening his mouth to offer some explanation, some counter-narrative, the same practiced charm he'd relied on his entire adult life to talk his way out of every previous consequence. And that was the exact moment Agent Wynn and her team moved, before he could utter a single word that might have muddied the clarity of what everyone in that room had just witnessed with their own eyes. Federal agents who had been positioned throughout the room, indistinguishable moments earlier from catering staff and casual guests, converged on the stage and the room's exit simultaneously, moving with the practiced efficiency of a team that had rehearsed exactly this sequence. 2 agents I recognized from the catering staff set down their trays without a sound and closed the distance to the stage in seconds. Victor Lang was placed in handcuffs in front of every investor, journalist, and camera in that ballroom, along with 2 of his senior associates, a chief financial officer named Gregory Hale, and an operations director named Susan Mercer, who had been quietly identified during our investigation as active participants in the laundering scheme, and were pulled from the crowd within moments of Victor's arrest, their own carefully maintained composure crumbling just as completely as his had. I watched Victor's expression as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, the last flicker of that practiced charm finally extinguishing entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded, that I imagine very few people in his life had ever seen. He looked directly at me for a brief moment as agents guided him off the stage, and whatever he was trying to communicate in that look, anger, disbelief, some final attempt at intimidation, it landed on me with absolutely no effect at all. 31 years of staring down men far more dangerous than Victor Lang had taught me exactly how to receive that kind of look without flinching. Dominic Reyes, the organized crime figure Frank had traced the shell company network back to, was arrested separately that same evening, at a property nearly 40 miles away, part of a coordinated operation Agent Wynn's team had been preparing since receiving our file, timed to occur within minutes of the arrests at the ballroom, to prevent any possibility of him being warned and fleeing before agents could reach him. Frank received a brief confirmation text from Denise during the chaos of the ballroom, and when he showed it to me, both of us simply stood there for a moment, letting 6 weeks of careful, quiet work finally settle into something real. Emma stood frozen on that stage throughout the entire sequence, watching her father, the same quiet, unassuming man who brought her lunch and asked about her week, methodically dismantle a criminal empire in front of 200 witnesses, using evidence he'd apparently been gathering in secret for over a month. She didn't move for what felt like a long time, her eyes moving between the screens still displaying evidence behind her, the agents leading Victor toward the exit, and me, standing at the edge of the stage, until finally something in her seemed to release all at once, and she walked toward me on legs that didn't look entirely steady beneath her. When the room finally began to clear, when the agents finished their initial statements and the shock started settling into something closer to comprehension, Emma reached me and, tears streaming freely down her face, asked the only question that seemed to matter in that moment. "Dad, how long have you known? Why didn't you tell me?" I told her everything, right there, standing in the wreckage of what had almost become her downfall. I told her about the moment I saw Victor lean toward her through that glass wall, about the call to Frank that same night, about 6 weeks of quiet, careful work, built entirely to make sure that when the truth finally came out, there would be absolutely no way for anyone to twist it into something that hurt her. I told her about the nights in Frank's garage, the corkboard covered in red string, the recording device I'd worn to 2 visits I'd told her were simply about wanting to see her more often. I told her about Curtis Boyle, about Rebecca, the colleague who had come before her and paid a price Emma had never even known about, and I watched my daughter absorb, piece by piece, just how close she had come to a fate several other people hadn't managed to escape. She asked me, her voice still unsteady, why I hadn't simply told her what I suspected the moment I first became worried. Why I'd let her carry that fear alone for 6 more weeks, instead of bringing her into the plan from the beginning. I told her the truth I had been carrying since that very first afternoon. That I hadn't told her because I understood, in a way only a father who spent 31 years reading Dangerous Men could understand. That the safest thing I could do for my daughter was let her believe, right up until the last possible moment, that her old man really was just a harmless retired officer who liked bringing her lunch. Any change in her behavior, any flicker of newfound confidence or watchfulness, could have tipped Victor off that something had shifted, and I couldn't risk that. Not when his contingency plan already had her name written across every forged document, waiting to be activated the moment he sensed danger. She cried harder hearing that, not from anger, but from something closer to overwhelming relief, the particular kind of exhausted release that comes after carrying a fear alone for far too long, and finally understanding you never actually were alone at all. I held my daughter in the middle of that emptying ballroom, agents still processing the scene around us, catering staff quietly beginning to clear away trays of untouched champagne, journalists clustered near the exit, already filing early reports on their phones. And for a long moment, none of that mattered at all. It was just the 2 of us, standing in the exact center of everything I'd built over 6 weeks to protect her. I held my daughter in the middle of that emptying ballroom, agents still processing the scene around us, and I told her something I believe with my whole heart. Something I want to leave with you if you've stayed with this story until the end. Living in fear has never once solved anything. It only teaches the people threatening you that fear works. Real courage isn't loud, and it isn't fast. It's patient. It's quiet. It's a father sitting in his friend's garage for 6 weeks, organizing bank records at midnight, not because he wanted revenge, but because he understood that the right moment, chosen carefully and struck precisely, protects far more completely than any amount of anger ever could. Frank was there too, waiting near the ballroom entrance once he'd finished his final coordination call with Denise, and Emma pulled him into a fierce hug the moment she saw him, thanking him through tears for a debt she said she could never fully repay. Frank, never a man comfortable with open displays of emotion, patted her back awkwardly and told her the same thing he'd told me 100 times over the past 6 weeks. "Your dad's the one who noticed something was wrong the first day, Emma. I just helped him build the case properly. That instinct, the one that wouldn't let this go, that's all him." I drove Emma home myself that night, Frank following behind in his truck, to make sure we both got back safely after everything that had happened. And we sat in my car outside her apartment for nearly an hour after I parked, neither of us quite ready to end the conversation yet. She asked me question after question, filling in every gap in the 6 weeks she'd missed. And somewhere in that conversation, sitting in a parked car outside the same building where she'd spent so many recent nights afraid, I watched my daughter begin, for the first time since that afternoon at the glass conference room, to actually breathe easily again. In the months that followed, the federal case against Victor Lang and his associates expanded significantly beyond what Frank and I had originally uncovered, prosecutors ultimately identifying nearly $30 million in laundered funds connected to the network, along with evidence tying Victor to bribery, involving at least 2 mid-level government procurement officials who had approved the inflated contracts in exchange for regular payments, disguised as consulting fees. Agent Nguyen kept me updated periodically as the case developed, and I remember the particular satisfaction of learning that Curtis Boyle, the former employee who had spoken to Frank off the record months earlier, agreed to testify formally once he understood how thoroughly the case had been built, no longer afraid that coming forward would simply disappear into nothing, the way he'd assumed it would, if he'd tried reporting Victor on his own. Emma was formally cleared of any wrongdoing within the first week, her compliance flag from months earlier becoming, ironically, one of the strongest pieces of evidence establishing her as the whistleblower rather than the conspirator Victor had tried to frame her as. I remember sitting beside her in a federal prosecutor's office as they walked her through exactly how her original compliance report, the very thing Victor had used as leverage to threaten her, had become the cornerstone proving her innocence. She cried in that meeting, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, finally catching up with months of quiet terror she'd been carrying alone. She testified before a federal grand jury with a composure that made me prouder than almost anything I'd witnessed in her entire life, walking prosecutors through the discrepancies she'd found, with the same careful, methodical precision that had made her so good at her job in the first place. Precision Victor had tried to weaponize against her, and instead became the clearest evidence of her integrity. The case against Victor Lang, Dominic Reyes, and 6 additional co-conspirators eventually resulted in convictions that will keep most of them behind bars for the majority of the coming decade. Victor himself receiving a sentence of 14 years on charges including money laundering, wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and witness intimidation. The last charge built almost entirely from the recordings I had gathered during those careful office visits. Emma left the ruins of Langford Dynamics with something I don't think she expected to find in the wreckage: a reputation, quietly circulating through the region's finance community, as the sharp young analyst who had refused to be silenced by a powerful man, and who had ultimately helped bring down one of the largest laundering operations the state's Financial Crimes Division had prosecuted in nearly a decade. Several established firms reached out to her directly in the weeks following the trial's conclusion, offering positions with salaries and titles that would have seemed impossible to her a year earlier, and I watched my daughter, for the first time in her professional life, have the genuine freedom to choose exactly what she wanted her career to look like, rather than simply taking whatever door happened to open first. 8 months after that night in the ballroom, she opened her own small financial consulting firm, specializing, with a pointed sense of purpose I recognized immediately as her mother's stubborn integrity living on in her, in compliance and fraud detection services for companies who genuinely wanted to do things the right way. She named the firm Sullivan Carter Consulting, insisting on including Frank's name alongside our own family name, a gesture that made the old man tear up at the small dinner we held to celebrate her opening, something I don't believe I'd seen Frank do even once in the 20 years I'd known him professionally. Her client list grew steadily over the following year, mostly through word of mouth among business owners who'd heard her story, and wanted someone in their corner who genuinely understood what it looked like when the numbers were hiding something dangerous. I spend most of my days now exactly the way a retired man is supposed to, tending a small garden behind the house Diane and I bought together 30 years ago, fishing with Frank on Saturday mornings when the weather allows it, and watching my grandchildren, Emma's 2 children, grow up in a world I fought hard, in more ways than one, to make a little bit safer for them. Emma married a good man named David 3 years ago, a quiet, steady schoolteacher who has never once, in all the time I've known him, made her feel like she needed to shrink herself to fit into someone else's ambitions, the way Victor Lang had tried to do. Emma brings the kids by most Sundays now. Dinner around the same table where she grew up, the same table Diane and I once sat at planning Emma's childhood. And sometimes, watching her laugh with her kids in my kitchen, I think about that glass conference room, about the exact moment everything could have gone a very different direction if I had simply looked away, told myself it wasn't my business, let an old habit of staying quiet win out over an old instinct that had never once failed me in 31 years of service. I think, too, about what I told Emma that night in the ballroom, words I've carried with me through every stage of my life since. Real power was never about the badge I carried for 3 decades, and it was never about the weapon I trained to use more times than I care to count. Real power is being able to protect the person you love most, at exactly the right moment, without ever having to raise your voice to do it. That is the only kind of strength that ever truly mattered to me, and it's the only kind of strength I hope my grandchildren inherit when they're old enough to understand this story fully. My oldest grandson, only 6 now, likes to ask me sometimes whether I was ever a superhero when I worked at the border, and I always tell him the same thing his mother eventually understood on her own. The strongest people rarely look like heroes while they're doing the work. Most of the time, they just look like someone's quiet, unremarkable old dad, patiently waiting for the right moment. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe that quiet patience is the strongest form of protection a parent can offer their child, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.